Dust and Desperation, The Last Ride of Boone Harlow. Prologue, Ghosts of the Past. The Dakota Badlands had a way of swallowing a man whole. Jagged rocks jutted out of the earth like the bones of some long-dead beast, while the wind howled across the plains, whispering tales of all who'd tried to tame the land, and failed. For Boone Harlow, it wasn't the land that haunted him, but the ghosts of his past. Boone sat hunched over a scarred wooden table in the corner of a dimly lit saloon. His battered hat rested low over his brow, shadowing eyes that had seen too much. A half-empty bottle of rye sat between his calloused hands, the amber liquid catching the faint flicker of the lantern light. The saloon was quiet tonight, too quiet. A few rough-looking men nursed their drinks at the bar, muttering to themselves or staring into nothing. The bartender, a wiry man with a face carved from stone, watched Boone with wary eyes. Boone knew the look well. Men like him carried a certain air, violence clung to them like the dust on their boots. The silence broke as the saloon doors creaked open. A figure stepped inside, wrapped in a black coat that billowed like smoke behind him. His boots struck the floorboards with deliberate precision, each step drawing every eye in the room. Boone didn't look up, but his hand drifted toward the revolver holstered at his hip. "Boone Harlow," the man said, his voice smooth as polished steel. Boone didn't answer. He lifted his glass and took a long, slow sip. The man in black walked closer, pulling a chair from another table and sliding it across the floor until he was sitting opposite Boone. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and placed a small leather pouch between them. "I hear you're a man who gets things done," the stranger said. His eyes were sharp, cutting through the haze of whiskey and regret that clouded Boone's mind. Boone finally looked up. His face was weathered, every line and scar telling a story. His eyes, grey as a stormy sky, locked onto the stranger. "Depends on what needs doing," Boone said. His voice was low and gravelly, like the rumble of thunder on the horizon. The man in black smiled faintly and pushed the pouch toward Boone. The dull jingle of silver coins filled the space between them. "There's a man I need brought in," the stranger said. "Goes by the name of the Scorpion." Boone's hand froze halfway to the bottle. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. "I'm not interested," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. The man in black didn't flinch. 5,000 silver dollars. Alive. Boone's lips pressed into a thin line. $5,000 was enough to buy a new life, far away from the Badlands and the memories that haunted him. But he knew this wasn't about money. It never was. "The Scorpion," Boone said, the name rolling off his tongue like poison. "What's your interest in him?" The stranger's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say his trail of sins has gone on long enough." Boone stared at the pouch of silver, his mind racing. The Scorpion wasn't just another outlaw. He was the man Boone held responsible for the worst day of his life, the day his wife and son were ripped away from him. "I'm done chasing ghosts," Boone said, shoving the pouch back across the table. "Ghosts have a way of finding you, whether you're chasing them or not," the man said, standing. He leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Dead man's bluff. That's where you'll find him. But if you don't take the job, someone else will. And they won't bring him in alive." With that, the man in black turned and walked out, leaving Boone alone with his thoughts. For a long time, Boone sat in silence, staring at the bottle of rye. He thought of his wife's smile, his son's laughter, and the blood that had soaked the earth the day they died. Finally, Boone stood, leaving the bottle untouched. He grabbed his hat and revolver, the weight of the weapon a familiar burden at his side. Dead man's bluff. The ghosts could wait a little longer. Section 2, Into the Wasteland. The Dakota Badlands stretched out before Boone like the surface of a forgotten planet, barren and hostile. The sun hung low in the sky, a molten coin beating down on the cracked earth. Boone rode alone, his hat pulled low and his duster caked in dust. His horse, a sturdy bay named Ash, moved steadily beneath him, its hooves crunching over the hard ground. The words of the man in black echoed in Boone's mind, "Dead man's bluff. That's where you'll find him." The Scorpion, Boone had chased him once before, years ago. Back then, Boone was a lawman, a badge pinned to his chest and a belief, however fragile, in justice. That belief died the day he returned home to find his cabin burned to the ground, his wife and son's bodies lying in the ash. The scorpion spurs had left their mark in the dirt outside the ruins. Boone swore vengeance that day, but the trail had gone cold. Until now. Boone's grip tightened on the reins as he rode through a canyon. The walls rose high on either side, their jagged edges casting long shadows. A gust of wind whipped through the pass, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke. Boone's instincts prickled. Smoke meant people. People in these parts often meant trouble. He slowed Ash to a stop, dismounting and leading the horse to the edge of the canyon wall. There, he crouched low, his eyes scanning the horizon. Ahead, he spotted the source of the smoke, a campfire nestled near a cluster of boulders. 3 men sat around it, their laughter carried on the wind. Outlaws. Boone could tell by the way they carried themselves, loose, cocky, the kind of men who thought the barrel of a gun made them untouchable. Boone studied them carefully. They weren't the Scorpion's men, not directly. These were scavengers, the kind who followed bigger fish, picking at the scraps left behind. Boone had seen their kind before, and he knew they'd spotted his trail long before he'd seen their fire. His hand drifted to the revolver on his hip. Boone approached the camp slowly, leading Ash behind him. The laughter stopped as the men noticed him. One of them, a wiry man with a scraggly beard, stood and rested a hand on the rifle leaning against a rock. "Evening," Boone said, his voice calm and steady. The wiry man grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. "Evening. You looking for company, stranger?" "Just passing through," Boone said, stopping a few paces away. "But I reckon you've been watching my trail. Figured I'd save you the trouble of following me." The wiry man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Smart fella. Most folks don't got the sense to see trouble coming. But you still wandered right into it, didn't you?" Boone's eyes flicked to the other 2 men. One was a broad-shouldered brute sharpening a bowie knife, the other a younger man with a nervous twitch and a shotgun resting on his knee. "Reckon I did," Boone said. "But I've seen worse trouble than the likes of you." The wiry man's grin faltered. He looked Boone up and down, noticing the revolver and the hard lines of his face. "Who are you?" "Name's Harlow," Boone said simply. The name seemed to spark recognition. The wiry man's grin disappeared entirely, replaced by a scowl. "Harlow, who?" "Heard of you. Heard you left the law to chase bounties. Heard you got a real mean streak when you're crossways." Boone's hand hovered near his holster. "Depends on the company I keep." The wiry man nodded to his companions. "What do you say, boys? Think we should let old Boone here go on his merry way?" The brute with the bowie knife chuckled darkly. The nervous one didn't move, his eyes darting between Boone and the wiry man. The wiry man turned back to Boone, his grin returning like a wolf baring its teeth. "Reckon we'll take that fine horse of yours. Might even see what kind of coin you're carrying. Then we'll think about letting you go." Boone sighed. "You boys don't want to do this." The wiry man reached for his rifle, and Boone's hand moved in a blur. The crack of his revolver shattered the quiet, and the wiry man's head snapped back as a crimson mist painted the rocks behind him. The brute with the bowie knife lunged, but Boone's second shot struck him square in the chest, sending him tumbling into the dirt. The nervous one scrambled for his shotgun, his fingers fumbling as Boone's revolver barked a 3rd time. The blast knocked the young man flat, blood pooling beneath him. The canyon fell silent again, save for the echo of gunfire rolling through the cliffs. Boone holstered his revolver and stepped toward the campfire. He nudged the wiry man's body with his boot, ensuring he was dead, before rifling through the man's belongings. He found a handful of bullets, a flask of whiskey, and a crumpled map. Unfolding the map, Boone's eyes narrowed. It marked a trail leading north, with Dead Man's Bluff scrawled in crude letters near the edge. But there was something else, a symbol burned into the corner of the map. A raven, wings spread wide. Boone's jaw tightened. The raven. He tucked the map into his coat and mounted Ash, leaving the bodies for the vultures. As Boone rode on, the shadows deepened, and the wind carried a new sound, a low, keening wail, like the cries of the dead. He thought of the raven symbol and the rumors he'd heard in saloons. A preacher-turned-killer, carving cryptic messages into his victims. Boone had dismissed them as drunken tales, but now they felt too real. The scorpion wasn't just a bounty anymore. This trail was twisting into something darker, something Boone couldn't fully grasp. But one thing was certain, more ghosts were waiting for him ahead. Here's the continuation and conclusion of Dust and Desperation, the last ride of Boone Harlow. Section 3, The Raven's Shadow. Night had fallen by the time Boone reached the outskirts of a ghost town. The town was little more than a husk, abandoned shacks leaning against each other, their windows gaping like empty eye sockets. The wind whistled through the streets, carrying the faint creak of wood and the flutter of loose shingles. Boone dismounted Ash and tied the horse to a splintered hitching post outside what had once been a saloon. His hand rested on the grip of his revolver as he stepped inside. The air was heavy with dust and silence. Boone's boots echoed on the warped floorboards as he moved cautiously through the room. Tables lay overturned, and broken glass crunched underfoot. At the far end of the saloon, a figure sat in a chair, his head bowed. "Rough night?" Boone called out, his voice low but firm. The figure didn't move. Boone approached slowly, his revolver drawn. As he neared, the coppery scent of blood reached his nose. The man in the chair was dead, his chest carved with jagged letters. Boone leaned closer and read the words etched into the flesh, "The wages of sin is death." Boone cursed under his breath. The raven was close. The sound of a door creaking open drew Boone's attention. He spun, his revolver raised, as a tall, gaunt figure stepped into the moonlight streaming through the broken window. The man wore a tattered preacher's coat, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A long knife gleamed in his hand. "The wages of sin," the man said, his voice hollow, "cannot be paid with silver, Boone Harlow." Boone kept his gun trained on the raven, his jaw tightening. "You've been following the scorpion's trail, just like me. What's your stake in this?" The raven tilted his head, his lips curling into a grim smile. "The scorpion is a servant of chaos. His sins run deep, but his death will serve a greater purpose. As will yours." Before Boone could respond, the raven lunged. Boone fired, but the man moved like a wraith, his knife slicing through the air. Boone sidestepped the blade, his boot catching the raven in the ribs and sending him sprawling. The fight was brutal and close quarters. The raven slashed at Boone's arm, drawing blood, but Boone's revolver cracked again, grazing the raven's shoulder. The preacher stumbled back, his dark eyes burning with fury. "You'll find him at Dead Man's Bluff," the raven hissed, clutching his wound. "But when you do, you'll see the truth. He's more than an outlaw. He's the key to breaking this cursed land. You'll have to decide what kind of man you are, Harlow." Before Boone could fire another shot, the raven hurled a glass lantern at his feet. Flames erupted, cutting Boone off as the preacher vanished into the night. Section 4, Showdown at Dead Man's Bluff. The blood-red moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over Dead Man's Bluff. The jagged cliff loomed above Boone like the edge of the world. He dismounted Ash and climbed the rocky path, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. At the summit, he found the scorpion waiting. The outlaw stood near the edge, his silhouette sharp against the crimson sky. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a leather coat, his spurs jingling as he turned to face Boone. "So, you made it," the scorpion drawled, his voice smooth and venomous. "I was starting to think you'd given up." Boone leveled his revolver at the outlaw. "This ends tonight." The scorpion smirked, pulling a locket from his pocket and holding it up. Boone froze, his breath catching in his throat. The locket was identical to the one his wife had worn the day she died. "Recognize this?" the scorpion asked. "I took it from your cabin, Harlow." Thought it might come in handy someday. Boone's hand trembled on the trigger. Why? He growled. Why'd you do it? The scorpion's smirk widened. I didn't kill your family, Harlow. That was the Raven. He wanted to set you on this path, make you his weapon. You were too blind with grief to see it. Boone's mind reeled. You're lying, he said, but the doubt in his voice betrayed him. Am I? The scorpion said, tossing the locket at Boone's feet. Your boy ain't dead, Harlow. The Raven took him. He's been using him to keep you on a leash, sending you after men like me. But here's the thing, you kill me, and you'll never see your son again. The weight of the words hit Boone like a blow to the chest. His revolver wavered. Before he could respond, the sharp sound of boots on rock echoed behind him. Boone turned to see the Raven emerging from the shadows, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. The scorpion speaks the truth, the Raven said, his voice cold. Your son is alive. But his blood will cleanse this land of its sins. You've served your purpose, Boone. Now it's time to finish this. The three men stood in a deadly triangle, the tension crackling like a storm about to break. You've got a choice to make, Harlow, the scorpion said. Pull that trigger and end this, or walk away and save your boy. Boone's hand shook. He looked from the scorpion to the Raven, his mind racing. Every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance, but the thought of his son, alive, somewhere out there, held him back. The Raven took a step closer, his voice a dark whisper. Justice or redemption, Boone? What kind of man are you? The blood-red moon bathed the scene in crimson light as Boone raised his revolver. Section 5, The Gunshot. The sound of a gunshot split the night, echoing across the Badlands. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a body fell. Section 6, Epilogue, Dust and Desperation. Dawn broke over the Badlands, painting the cliffs in shades of gold and amber. Boone rode alone, his coat blood-stained and his hat pulled low. In his hand, he clutched the locket. His son's face swam in his mind, a faint glimmer of hope in a world drowning in dust and despair. Behind him, Dead Man's Bluff was silent once more, the echoes of gunfire fading into the wind. The scorpion and the Raven were gone, their fates left behind on that cursed cliff. Boone didn't look back. The road ahead was long, and the ghosts of his past would follow him wherever he went. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. The question remained, had he chosen justice or redemption? The truth was a burden only he would carry. And the Badlands, as always, kept their secrets. The end. Join the adventure with the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed. If you're loving our cowboy stories and captivating tales, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all our future posts. Saddle up and ride along with us.